Ed Berg, you're the first to comment. Good to see you, my holy brother. Who else is with us? Where are you tuning in from? Patsy White is with us. Welcome, Patsy. Okay, here we go. Janice Beanstalk in the house. Wonderful to see you all. All right. The class is gathering. Cindy Schnabel Berman, welcome to the program. All right, we are going to finish chapter 9 today. I mean, with God's help, can't predict everything that's going to happen in the future, even a few minutes away. But with God's help, we'll finish chapter 9 today. And we're going to cruise through not one, not two, but 3 Mishnahs. These are very short Mishnahs with short Gemaras, short commentaries on them. So where are we? We're holding in the second tractate of the Talmud, Masechet Shabbos. Today we're going to finish chapter 9, and we are on Daf Tzadi. That's page 90. Linda Kretschmer in the house. Andrea Greenberg from Princeton, New Jersey. Joyce Noack says shalom from Amsterdam. Can't sleep. Hopefully we won't put you to sleep with our class, but if we do, it wouldn't be the worst thing. You need a soporific. Sonia Cagna says hello. All right, my holy brothers and sisters. Page 90, Daf Tzadi. And after a whole bunch of digressions from the topic of Shabbos here in chapter 9, where these Mishnahs that we covered previously in chapter 9 were related because, they were rulings of the rabbis, decrees of the rabbis looking for support in scripture, though not proof text, but rather in the form of allusions. And we had a bunch of teachings about the giving of Torah. It was beautiful the last 2 days, page 88 and page 89. And now we're back to the subject of carrying out on Shabbos. So what is the minimum measure of certain items that if one carries them from the private domain out into the public domain, or from the public domain back into the private domain, one becomes liable if you carried unwittingly. If you do it intentionally, you become liable to excision at the hands of heaven. But if you did it unwittingly, because you didn't know it was prohibited, or you didn't realize that you were carrying for whatever reason, or you didn't realize it was Shabbos, so then you would become liable to bring a sin offering, a chatas, when the temple stands. But if the measure of the thing that you're carrying is so small that it's insignificant, so then you don't become liable to bring the sin offering. And so now we're getting back to the topic of defining these minimum measures to become liable to bring the sin offering. So let's roll. Mishnah number 5 of chapter 9. It's just a whole bunch of items. We're going to define the minimum measure. Somebody who carries wood, he's carrying wood out from the public domain, from the private domain to the public domain. Let us say he's going out from his residence. How much wood would render him liable? Enough that if you burned it, it would be enough fuel to cook 1 egg. Spices. Enough spices to season 1 cooked egg. And if you had various spices, they join together, right? So if you had just a little bit of seasoning, it's not enough to season even 1 scrambled egg, but combined with, a little cayenne and a little salt, and together there's enough to season the egg. So that would be the minimum measure, and if you carry that out on Shabbos, liable to bring the sin offering. Nutshells, pomegranate peels, safflower, madder. These are items that are used to make dye in order to color a fabric, color a textile. How much is the minimum measure to become liable? Enough to dye a woman's hair covering, like a hair net, a hair kerchief, a very small garment, just enough to sort of be a topper over a woman's hair. So enough to dye that small garment would be enough for the minimum measure. Urine, natron, borit, Kimolian earth, and potash, these are all substances used for cleaning clothes, laundry. Can you imagine in the ancient world they would use urine to clean laundry? Urine comes up from time to time, not as something disgusting that we don't like to talk about, but in the ancient world as an item that they would use for industrial purposes. And here one of its uses is in laundry. But it's also even used occasionally, as just one very small amount as part of incense. Never for the temple incense, because it is a disgusting item, but in other kinds of incense it would be sometimes used. But here we're talking about laundry. So these items, urine, natron, borit, Kimolian earth, potash, enough to launder that women's hair covering, right? The previous items were enough to create a dye that would color it, that would dye it, and this is enough to launder such a garment, the small garment. With regard to wood, we get into the Gemara, and the Gemara asks, well, didn't we already define wood? Because we talked about a reed, and if it was a thin reed, it would be enough to make a pen out of it, to make a quill that you could, draw up some ink and then write 2 letters with it. But if it was a thick reed, not appropriate for making a writing instrument out of it, we learned then that it would be for burning, and it would be enough to cook an egg, as we've seen before. But wood is more typically used for burning than for something else. And here, the alternative use that's given is that you can make the tooth of a key with it, right? So in the ancient world, they didn't have nice brass keys and the nice industrial machines that we have now to make very precise keys. They would actually make keys out of wood, and they were much larger objects, and they would be fitted to these large, doors with big keyholes, and they would make a key out of wood. But it's much more typical to use wood as a fuel for burning, and so the measure is enough to cook an egg. Regarding the nutshells and pomegranate peel, safflower and madder, so the measure here is enough to dye a garment that could be used as a woman's hair covering. So the Gemara says, doesn't that contradict another Mishnah where we learned that for certain kinds of herbs that are used as a dye, it would be enough to dye a small sample of a cloth that you would put on the loom, on the shuttle in a loom, so that you would, I guess, know what color thread you're using and where you're headed, the type of fabric that you want to weave. And so the answer, is given by Rav Nachman in the name of Rabba Bar Avu, that the sample for the weaver is a much smaller garment, just a sample, than the woman's hair covering. However, one does not begin a dyeing process just to make one sample, right? You make a sample after you've already made a decision to create enough dye to, probably to do more of an industrial process and color a lot of clothing. But for a woman's hair covering, you might decide to go to the trouble to get the plant materials and create a dye so that you could have a beautiful garment for the woman's hair. And that's why we get the minimum measure from the lady's hair, from the hair covering, rather than from the weaver's sample. In passing, we learned that when urine is used as an element of laundry detergent, it only retains its potency, its ability to act as an element in laundry detergent for 40 days. After that, the urine breaks down. We also heard this term borit, which is used among other laundry products. And what's so interesting here is that our sages, this is where we see that it's not like the Talmud was a Talmud conference or a Talmud project where they got together for a few months or a few years and figured it all out. The Talmud, is a record of conversations that were written over hundreds of years. The conversations, the debates happened over hundreds of years, and in different places, in the Holy Land, in Babylonia, and in many spread out communities within the Persian Empire, that included Babylonia. And the result of that, because they had much less communication between cities and towns back then than we do now, is that there were just different traditions, different customs, different industries in different geographic regions. And so it would happen that sages debating a point in one area heard a teaching from another area and didn't even know what was being described. So here, this item, borit, what is it? The sages don't know what it is. And they start to argue. One of them says sand, another says sulfur, and they finally conclude that it means aloe. So these are really different potential meanings for this word borit, and they finally conclude it's aloe, but it just shows us that even they were not sure about the meanings of certain words, and so they would send out and try to figure it out and reach an understanding so that they could pass a law on how much of that item could be carried and used. That's the end of Mishnah number 5. Now we go into Mishnah number 6. Pepper. How much pepper can a person carry out on Shabbos and be liable for carrying a significant item from let's say, the private domain out into the public domain? Answer, any amount. Pepper, any amount. Why is pepper useful? Is it to season the egg? We thought that pepper was enough to season an egg when we talked about spices. Why is pepper singled out from among spices, and somebody who carries any amount of pepper would become liable to bring the sin offering? Answer, because pepper, unlike other spices, can be used as a treatment for foul breath. I didn't know that. I mean, we actually had this earlier in our study, but before I was studying the Talmud, I didn't know that you could use pepper for foul breath. I don't know if anybody still uses it that way. I guess, we have gum and mouthwash and other treatments and toothpaste for foul breath that people didn't have back then. But it's interesting that you could have just a tiny amount of pepper in your mouth and it would take care of foul breath. Likewise, tar. Tar, any amount. Like when you think of tar, I mean, who wants tar? It's just like if you're going to put on your roof, okay. But apparently tar, a small amount of it, you can eat it and it treats a headache. I assume it's eaten. I don't think you would rub it on your head. But I guess you eat it and it is a treatment for headache. Perfume, any amount. Metals, any amount. Stones or earth of the altar. Now, this is fascinating, right? So if you merit to visit the Mishkan, the tabernacle, while it was standing, when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert, or once it settled into Shiloh, or eventually in Jerusalem, or once the temple was built in Jerusalem by King Solomon, and it stood for another 400 years. Then it was destroyed. There was a 70-year hiatus. And then the second temple was built, and that stood for another 400 years, a little more than 400. So during those 1,200 years, there was a central altar for the Jewish people. And that altar, it had to only be built of uncut stones. So if for some reason some of it was damaged and they were going to bring some new stones, and now stones that had formerly been part of the altar, maybe some of it chipped off, and a person might really cherish to have a little chip, right? Even just a tiny little bit of the sacred altar on which the offerings were brought on behalf of the whole Jewish nation. So any pebble, any bit of earth that comes from the sacred precinct, from the altar itself, or even from the courtyard of the temple, any amount would become significant if you carried it on Shabbos, right? We're defining what is the minimum measure of something that renders it significant. And when we talk about a sacred object like stones or earth from the altar, any amount is significant. Scrolls, so Sephorim, meaning like a Torah scroll or other books, in ancient times, they didn't have what's called a codex, what we think of as a book that has a cover and pages. This is actually called a codex, by librarians and archaeologists. But previous to the invention of this kind of book, a bound book, and even before there was a printing press, there were bound books that were made mostly by monks, I believe. But But before that, they looked like Torah scrolls, right? So two rods and the paper wound up on them and moving from one dowel to the other. So a scroll, or the covering of a scroll, obviously that's a sacred object, but if the scroll was destroyed by a marauding insect, which insect? A mekek, okay, a mekek. So it's some kind of an insect that eats parchment, right? So that eats the kind of paper of which the Holy Scrolls were made, or its coverings. And, you can imagine if you've ever seen moths get into clothing and just eat so much of it and leave the clothing full of holes, and it's no longer something you can wear. It's no longer serviceable as a holy scroll, as a holy book, as especially a Torah scroll. But because it was a sacred text to begin with, it retains some aspect of its holiness. And so even if you had a little piece of it, you would be liable to bring the sin offering if you carried it out on Shabbos, because it bears that sacredness. Rabbi Yehuda adds, even if you had some pieces of an idol that had been used for idolatry. Now, a few weeks ago, we learned that the idols of idolatry transmit tuma, transmit ritual impurity. Here we're talking about how much of an item that you're carrying is going to render you to bring a sin offering just for violating the prohibition on carrying, right? Carrying something on Shabbos, that's prohibited. So when we talk about just a little piece of something that was an idol that idolaters worship, why would a Jew have such a thing? First of all, because it's a piece, we learned that only the entire idol transmits tuma. So once it shatters, it's smashed, it's broken, it doesn't transmit ritual impurity. So you might think that carrying it is not significant, but it is significant. Even a little piece, it won't transmit ritual impurity. But somebody who's a righteous person and for some reason finds this bit of idolatry in his house, he might be motivated to burn it. That's actually the command, that you can burn things that were used for idolatry. He wants to be rid of it, and he wants to make sure that nobody comes by accident to use something that was used in idolatry for some other purpose where it would be prohibited because it was formerly a piece of an idol. So he plans to burn it, or perhaps throw it in the ocean, get rid of it in a permanent way. Let's say to burn it. So he's saving it to burn it at the first opportunity. Therefore, because he's planning to burn it, it is a significant object. And if he's carrying it out on Shabbos, he becomes liable to bring the sin offering. So in addition to these items mentioned in the Mishnah, for which any amount renders you liable to bring the sin offering, the Gemara adds scented oil, any amount, purple dye, any amount. That's not explained here in the Talmud, but it's just my own recollection that purple dye is considered royal, right? It's like only royalty could afford to have garments that were purple, because it's a very, very expensive process to produce the color purple. I could be wrong about that, so if I'm mistaken, let me know in the comments. Metal, any amount, right? Because a piece of metal, who knows what you're going to fabricate out of it? At the very least, you could make a nail, and a nail is a very small amount of substance. So basically, the sages decree that in terms of metals, any amount. A related teaching is if you're going to donate some kind of metal to the use of the temple. You're going to donate it to the temple. So in other words, you're going to consecrate this piece of metal that you own by donating it to be used in the temple in some way. So now there's actually a minimum amount that you can donate. Less than that is considered inappropriate as a donation to the temple. There were collection boxes. So certainly even the poorest person could make a donation to the holiness of the temple. You could donate a peruta, right? Like basically a penny. But if we're talking about iron, copper, or silver, the minimum measure of iron was, I guess, a sheet flattened out that's 1 cubit by 1 cubit. What would such a piece of iron be used for? That would be enough to create an impediment to ravens, right? So they would actually use iron in this way and you see this actually all the time in public buildings and public parks today, where they make like basically a spike strip that has kind of nails sticking out of it so that ravens won't perch there and drop what ravens drop. We don't want bird droppings to fall on the holy temple. And so they would use iron to make these like raven impediments. In terms of copper, the minimum measure, what's the smallest thing that you can make out of copper that could be utilized in the temple? And the answer is a small hook that they would use to scrape the wax out of the menorah, the candelabrum that would always be kept burning during the days in the holy temple. And if you wanted to donate silver, now we would measure it as a money weight, and the minimum measure is a dinar. A dinar was a small amount of silver, a silver coin. And those are the minimum measures of metal. We just digress for a moment to talk about minimum measures for a donation to the temple, but what we're talking about is minimum measures to render you liable to bring a sin offering if you carried out on Shabbos, and the answer for metal was any amount. Now we move on to the final Mishnah of chapter 9. This is Mishnah number 7, and we learn that if a person carries a merchant's basket out on Shabbos. Now, let's say that there are several items in the basket, each of which belongs to a different category of stuff. So you might think that, he's got more than the minimum measure of food and more than the minimum measure of material to make dye for clothing, and more than the minimum measure, of copper that could be used to make things, etc. So there's different kinds of items in this basket. So does the person become liable to bring a sin offering for each category of substance that he carried out on Shabbos more than the minimum measure? And the answer is no. He's only liable to bring one sin offering because all of the objects were in one basket and the person carried one thing. Now that's good foreshadowing for chapter 10 that with God's help we'll open tomorrow. Chapter 10 is also going to be about carrying on Shabbos and things that make you liable to bring the sin offering for carrying on Shabbos. But instead of looking at the minimum measure and the objects themselves, we're going to talk about how the person carries them. Is it significant? Are they really carrying it? Or if two people are carrying an object together and it's exactly the minimum measure, so you could say that each is actually carrying only half of its weight. So each person, are they responsible for carrying the whole thing and they're both liable? Or maybe each one is only responsible for half of a minimum measure and therefore neither is liable. Those are the kind of questions we're going to look at when we get into chapter 10 tomorrow. And the final thing that we learn, that we'll talk about, that we learn here in the 7th Mishnah and its Gemara, is that what if somebody is carrying out a locust? Now, it's interesting that in terms of a locust, there are kosher locusts and non-kosher locusts, right? So there's many species of locust, right? Locust, it looks like a grasshopper. Some locusts are very beautiful. Earlier this year, we had quantities of locusts swarming on the African subcontinent that were devastating to crops. So we had locusts this year, we had plague this year, now we've got riot. Quite a year that we're having. But at any rate, there are locusts that are edible. They are kosher insects that can be eaten, and there are locusts that are not kosher. So even though they're technically edible, a Jew is not permitted to eat them. So with regard to a live kosher locust, the minimum measure for carrying out such creatures is any amount. Presumably that means one, right? So any amount, but it's a living creature, so you can't have less than one. So the minimum amount would be one living locust. If it's a dead kosher locust, then the minimum amount would be the same as the minimum amount for any human edible food. It would be the volume of a dried fig bulk, right? So that's if it's a dead kosher locust. Just locust is a pretty big creature. A dried fig is much smaller, so it's enough of that creature that's now dead that would have the same volume as a dried fig. Interestingly, if it's a live, non-kosher locust, what is the minimum amount? Why is this significant? Why would anyone come to carry such a thing? The Gemara answers, because a person might save a live but not kosher locust to give to his child as a pet to play with, right? And then the Gemara asks, but aren't we afraid that the child will come to eat it? And he might come to eat it, and then he would have eaten a non-kosher insect. We shouldn't give such a thing to a child. And Rabbi Yehuda answers, if you give a child this beautiful insect so that it would be his or hers as a little pet, first of all, the child is not going to bite it while it's alive. And here in passing, we learn we do not eat living things while they're alive, right? So even the kosher locust, we would never take a bite of it while it is alive. It doesn't get shechted the way that a mammal does, the way a cow or a goat or a sheep does. Just like a fish, you just simply kill it. And then, I guess you could eat it raw, but you would probably cook it. And then it would be edible. But our sages instruct us very firmly, we never eat a living creature. And that's one of the Noahide laws that applies to all of humanity. Just like we would never tear a limb off of a living creature, can't imagine anything more horrible than that, in order to eat it. Likewise, even at the level of an insect, we do not eat a living thing. Period. End of story. One might ask, can you take a bite of a plant while it's still in the ground so that it's a living thing? I don't know the answer, but I would personally say that according to the spirit of this teaching, no, you need to harvest the plant and then eat it. And this just shows this respect that we have for the gift that we've been giving of being allowed to eat other life, plant life or animal life, but we would never eat it while it's actually alive. We would give it enough respect to slaughter it first and then eat it. So Rabbi Yehuda says that with respect to the child that was given a living non-kosher locust as its little pet, first of all, the child instinctively knows that you don't eat a living thing. And second, after it dies, if it was the pet of this child, he's still not going to eat it. In fact, says Rabbi Yehuda, the child will eulogize his pet. And it's such a lovely, colorful way to end our journey through chapter 9 of Tractate Shabbos. The child would have become attached to his locust and would eulogize it rather than eat it once it had died. And I could really imagine that little scene. I love it. I love it. Okay, let me check the comments to see if there are comments or questions that I can answer. Melissa Beineman says, kosher locust? I don't remember seeing that. Yes, indeed. Here we have it. How do you define which locust is kosher and which is not? We'll find that elsewhere in our journey through the Talmud. It's pretty technical. I mean, locusts, they're all pretty similar to each other. But for some reason, some are kosher and some are not. What about a piece of fruit from the vine? Well, sure, because you pluck it, right? We could certainly eat fruit. Now, there are rules about fruit that have to do with Bikurim. One who grows fruit has to bring the first fruits to the temple each year when the temple stands. There's the laws of Orla. And this applies actually even now, that if you have a fruit tree, in its first 3 years, the fruit is prohibited, it's forbidden. In the 4th year, you can bring the offering, and I think even today you can start to eat the fruit of the tree. But I think what we wouldn't do is sort of like there's an apple hanging on the tree, and like just take a bite while it's still hanging on the tree. We take the apple off the tree, and it's a pretty small difference. And by the way, please understand, in terms of eating a living plant while it's still attached to the ground, I do not know the law. I haven't looked that up. I'm guessing. This is pure conjecture from Sal. What I can tell you is in terms of an animal, a living creature that's an animal, not a plant, no, we do not take a bite or swallow any kind of creature while it is alive. I was just extrapolating from my own consciousness with regard to plants. I personally, and I don't know that this is a law of kashrus, I just personally think I wouldn't take a bite from an apple while it's still literally on the tree. I would take it from the tree, and then it would be okay. For me. Sal, can you tell me about the use of stone vessels as pertaining to the purity laws? Ron, I'm sorry. That is actually a complex subject. Can a stone vessel become impure? Certainly a clay vessel can become impure, but like if we're talking about like a mortar, like an actual bowl that's fashioned from a solid piece of stone, I do believe that it can become impure, but I haven't done my research on that. I am not one of those mountains of Talmudic knowledge where I have all of this memorized, right? So I've learned a lot. I can comment on a lot of things, but if I don't have that law at my fingertips, I'm not going to tell you the answer and be wrong. I pray every time that I teach, and I'll say the prayer now, please God, do not let me mislead anybody because I made an error, okay? Other questions? Melissa said, I remember there being a purple or blue dye that was used for a thread in each of the four corners of a tallis. Could that also be a reason? Well, that's techelis. So that's made, that blue is made, I think it's called the chilazon. It's a snail. And we think we might have found the correct snail to produce that blue dye. But we're not sure, so it's debated. But there's enough people in the religious Jewish world who think that we did find the right snail to produce the blue dye, that's why people have started wearing, again, tzitzis that have the blue thread in it. Like the tzitzis that I'm wearing now is all white, and that's kind of like a daily wear tzitzis. But my tallis, my prayer shawl, does have in its tzitzis the blue. So this is, and there's a couple of different possibilities. There's like two possibilities of the snail, and it's kind of approved by different certifying authorities. Let's say in Israel, Chabad doesn't. People in Chabad generally will not wear a blue thread in their tzitzis. But a lot of people do these days. And I like it because when we read the Shema every day, twice a day, it says, God spoke to Moses saying, speak to the people and say to them, you will put a tzitzis on the corner of all your garments, and you will put a blue thread in the tzitzis on the corners so that whenever you look at the tzitzis, you'll be reminded of all my commandments. And from when may we say the Shema in the morning? From when there's enough light in the sky to distinguish. There's differing opinions on this, but one of the opinions is when there's enough light in the sky to distinguish the blue thread in your tzitzis from the white. So it's such an ancient and beautiful and important teaching that it's good enough for me that there's enough authorities in Israel who rule that today's blue thread is kosher. But literally for 1,000 years, no one had blue in their tzitzis. To answer your question, in terms of the purple dye that we're talking about here, that any amount renders it significant. I mean, I don't think that purple is the same as a techelis. It's not the same word. So I think they're talking about dye to make beautiful clothing, not necessarily sacred clothing. There's not a ruling here on techelis. That kind of ink, that dye, I'd have to look it up, but I would not be surprised if the minimum amount is enough to dye one thread for the tzitzis. If somebody knows that ruling, let me know. Okay, that's what I've got over there. And Lynn Job is saying, what is she saying? Here we go again with bugs and tubes and 60 seals. So that's a teaching that we didn't cover in our class today. That has to do with creating a talisman for certain bugs, that you could take a certain kind of insect. It's a specific insect, called it Siporit keramim, and it becomes significant because it would be used to make a talisman to help a person grow in wisdom. If you want to look that teaching up, it's here on page 90 of Masechet Shabbos. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. I hope that you enjoy this teaching and that you grew in wisdom a little bit. May we all be blessed with a peaceful evening. I'm happy to report that here in LA, the mayor announced that there won't be a curfew tonight, so at least the authorities are not expecting more of the violence and rioting. And hopefully we've rounded that corner, that the demonstrations can continue peacefully and people can come out en masse, express themselves, have their voices heard, and not have those protests be hijacked, by this terrible element that is just exploiting the opportunity to riot and to steal and to loot and to pillage, and to burn. All these family-owned businesses that were burned to the ground. It's just horrible. So please, God, none of that should happen anymore, and people can express themselves in a peaceful manner. And may that peace be present around the world this evening. Sending you all lots of love from LA. Take care, my holy brothers and sisters.